Okay, good morning, everyone. For those I have not yet met, my name is Wendy Chang, and I'm with the Dwight Stewart Youth Fund and also the co-chair of the Arts Ed Funders Council. We're thrilled to have you today, and this is our second collaboration with Southern California Grantmakers, in which we're aiming to have a deeper dive into the issues in our public education system and examine ways to provide students with quality education that embraces the arts. So the Funders Council, and we just had our meeting prior, consists of about 30 funders who collectively invest in arts education in LA County public schools to promote not only educational excellence, but also positive youth development and career pathways in our vibrant local economy. We're happy to have this conversation today, which will present members from philanthropy, public education, as well as the county's mental health and probation departments to demonstrate solutions rooted in public-private collaborations that are shaping in our schools and our communities. I'm pleased to now welcome up Denise, who's our Director of Arts Education at the Arts Commission, to tell you more about the overall investment in arts education, but how, not only that, but also how the county is providing the backbone support for hundreds of stakeholders working together to provide access to all public school students. Welcome up, Denise. Thank you.
Good morning. So I've been given the charge to provide context for where arts education is in LA County today and how we got there in 10 minutes or less. So I'm going to hopefully take you on a quick but fun journey. Starting with, this is the Richard Henry Dana Middle School in San Pedro. In the upper left corner is the opening of the school in 1928. My father graduated from there in the early 1950s. The pink version is when I graduated from there in the late 70s, the first graduating class after the earthquake retrofit. And the picture on the bottom is how it sits today as Richard Henry Dana Middle School. And my youngest daughter just graduated from there last year. When my father, my children are third generation LAUSD students. And when both my parents were going through LAUSD, they had K-12 arts instruction as a core part of their public education. Mine was a generation where it was cut, and I'll talk a little bit about why. And so my experiences were very hit and miss. And my children have had opportunities to engage in the arts in public education because I've navigated them through that process. And so I think we're at a point where we want to make sure that it's not up to parents who are aware to navigate their children to through a quality education, but to make sure that there's access for everyone. So how did we get here? Arts Education 101 history. So one of the first challenges dates back to 1970, and the Ryan Act was actually state legislation that first eliminated the dance and theater credentials in the state of California. That was followed shortly after by Proposition 13, which, as many of you know, changed the property tax, which dramatically changed how public education was funded in the state. It is true that in 1978, the state balanced the budget on the back of the arts, and the arts were cut from public education as a way of reconciling that severe budget crisis. And that is where what I will say now is a myth, that there's no arts happening in school and that all the arts have been cut. That's where it started. And every time we have financial challenge in our public education system. We go back to that narrative, but I argue that since that time, that's actually not been the case. And as we move through our work, we're recognizing that the arts are consistently being cut at a proportional level to all other subject areas, and sometimes less than other subject areas. So it's time for us to change the narrative that all the arts were cut and there's nothing happen, no arts in public education. Not true. We've had some good things happen. It was actually in 1994 that the arts were first recognized by the Federal Department of Education, that the arts were one of 9 core subject areas recognized by the then Goals 2000 legislation. In 2001 in California, that was the first time we had art standards recognized just like every other subject area. So we were on kind of a nice step, momentum moving forward. Then we were hit with No Child Left Behind, which for all of its good intentions, which was to really focus on equity and make sure that young people, no matter what their background, had equal access to quality education. That was its noble goal. The focus on testing and high stakes testing had a lot of unintended consequences and basically pushed out anything that wasn't testing. So math and English were prioritized, and really all other subject areas were less of a priority. But since then, in 2010, the Common Core standards came forward with a new approach to how we might educate young people. There was Proposition 30 in 2012, which started putting more money back into the public education system, new local control funding, and then most recently, the new federal legislation of the Every Student Succeeds Act continues to carry the importance of the arts as part of a well-rounded education. And then we've actually just in the last couple of years reversed the credentialing problems. And last month, the state of California just adopted new arts standards. So I want to convey that this is a long-standing problem, but we are definitely since 2010 have been building momentum and should continue to move in that way. So as the Director of Arts Education at the LA County Arts Commission, I oversee the Arts Education Collective. It's an initiative that was started in 2002 by the Board of Supervisors as a way of helping all 81 school districts restore the arts in public education. And the Board of Supervisors really recognized it as important for 3 reasons. One, the role of the arts as it's important to child development, the role of the arts as it's important to economic development, and the role of the arts as it's important to community development. So our county government stepped forward with that initiative. We launched in 2003 in 5 school districts because there are 5 county boards of supervisors. And it's continued to grow an average of 5 school districts a year, so that today there are 70 school districts plus 5 charter school networks that have joined the Arts Ed Collective. And we are on pace to be engaging all 81 school districts by 2020. Yeah, right? And I'll just say that as we reach this first benchmark of scale, our first benchmark was, can we ever get to completing the map and making it all orange? We've set our sights on 2020, but we know that engaging all districts still doesn't bring arts education to every child all year, every year. So I put forward that we are at a moment of evolving our definition of scale, where it has been engaging all districts, and our new definition of scale and equality is when every child in every classroom in every school has year-long instruction all year, every year. So a moment to shift our definition. Many of you may know that data as the backbone organization collecting and disseminating data is one of the core strategies in our work. And many of you may have attended the June meeting when we released the findings on, or discussed the findings of the arts education profile. This was a 2-year research study that really had 3 purposes. One, we wanted to be able to collect data from school districts and give it back to them in a way that was meaningful so that they could use it for strategic planning in their district. The second was that we wanted to make sure that any data we collected would be visible to the public so that parents or teachers or advocates, anyone could access it. Arts organizations could access it to see, is there any arts happening in that school? What other arts organizations are working there? So that was important. And then since we were going to be collecting all of the data in this one initial swath, we thought it would be important to just look for trends and particularly factors that were associated with quality, quantity, and equity. So just quickly, there were 2,277 schools. The number changes a few every year. We received responses from more than 70 across 74 school districts with a 41% response rate, which our researchers tell us was very high. And our researchers were very careful about attention to different types of schools so that the findings could be generalized and we could confidently state that the data we collected is actually a reflection of all schools across LA County and all school districts across LA County, with the exception of Long Beach because there wasn't enough representative participation from them. So I'm going to go quickly through some data points and some stats and findings. I've said many times, we were shocked to find that on average, 90% of public schools in LA County offered some arts instruction to some students, much higher than I expected. Again, more evidence that it's time to shift the narrative that there's no arts happening. But this is a huge caveat at the bottom of this, that 90% of schools are providing some arts instruction to some students. So it's important to take a deeper dive into some of the other findings. We've collected 2 different ways, the participation of nonprofit arts partners in public schools. And when we collected the data from arts partners in 2014, and then again in 2017, when we collected it from schools themselves, both times about half the schools work with a nonprofit arts organization or an arts partner, which means half of them don't. But again, if we've got over 2,000 schools, that means that over 1,000 of them are in partnership with a local arts organization or a teaching artist. So this slide shows us, so if this is the percentage of schools offering each arts discipline, this slide reinforces what we think we know, which was that music and visual arts are most frequently taught. But if you look at the green bars, it shows that less than half of elementary schools in the county provide any instruction in dance, theater, and media arts. So only half elementary schools provide any instruction in dance, theater, or media arts. Less than a third of the high schools provide any dance instruction, and only about half offer any theater or media arts. Okay, this is the big crazy slide that I'm going to talk you through. And so just don't try to find any detail. If you just kind of look at it as a wash of color, you can see that it starts small at the kindergarten. So the rows are art forms, the columns are grade levels, and there is less arts instruction happening at kindergarten, and it increases up until the middle schools. That makes sense, right? The teal is music, and the purple is visual arts. So as we expect, those are the 2 that have the most instruction. But if I can narrow your focus to the 4th grade column and to the teal box with the 9.5 percentage point on it, that's telling us that only 9.5% of schools that have 4th graders on their campus provide year-long music instruction to all 4th graders on that site. So while it's one thing to say that 90% of schools are offering some arts instruction to some students, the flip side of that is that only 9% of elementary schools with 4th graders are providing year-long music instruction to all of those 4th graders. And then although, yeah, I'll just leave that there and I'll keep going. The study, I won't go into it today, but the study was also looking at quality and quantity indicators, and the high-level findings are that, to no surprise, that students from low-income communities, those that are English language learners, and students of color not only receive less arts instruction, but the quality of the instruction they're receiving is lower than students that are attending school in schools where there's a higher population of white students. Schools with high populations of white students not only offer more arts instruction, but the quality of that instruction is better. So this led us to acknowledge that we've made some progress, but there's still a lot more work to be done. And in 2017, we convened something called the Arts Education Innovation Lab to really try to crack the nut about what we can do to really accelerate the rate of change and to really create a sense of urgency around making sure that all young people have access to the arts as a core component of quality education. Together, the group created the shared vision that every young person in LA County engages in the arts all year, every year, because the arts are fundamental to human growth and development. Oops. The work ended up paring down into what we're calling 5 pillars. And the 2 on the left, that the arts are core to education and that the arts can be a tool for advancing teaching and learning. That's kind of the lane that arts education has historically landed in, and that to really get it equity, if all youth are going to receive instruction, it needed to happen during the school day so that every child would have access. But what also surfaced in these new conversations was a new acknowledgement of the changing landscape of the need for self-initiated arts learning and also creative collaborative communities. The process had us create bold statements around each of these pillars. And, when we arrive, what's it going to look like? And so I just want to drill down on the self-initiated arts learning. And the bold statement was that every learner is able to access new innovative technologies that allow them to engage in the arts within and beyond the school walls, alone and with others. And then in terms of creative collaborative communities, acknowledging that creative collaborative communities nourish all learners, but also reciprocally that creative collaborative learners have an impact on their community. So I would argue that this most recent work is really pushing us to expand our aperture and understand that arts education, we need to continue to push to get to that new definition of equality, that all students receive it during the school day, but also push for a new definition of equity. If all students are getting it during the school day, then we need to provide additional resources for those youth who need it most. And so I challenge you to help us think creatively about what will need to change in order to achieve this agenda at scale and with equity, and to recognize that there are a lot of players in this ecosystem. And while we have historically moved from, as we historically moved from in-school to being more expansive, we can't take the pressure off the work in schools, but we need to be even more inclusive. I invite all of you, our initial regional plan for arts education, as I mentioned before, was launched in 2002 by the Board of Supervisors. So April, May, and June this year, we'll be engaging a public process to update that regional plan. And I invite all of you and all of your grantees and anyone you know who has an interest in this to really come out and participate in that process. It's important that the plan that is developed is not a document that sits on a shelf, but that it is a living, breathing document that we all feel ownership about, find our place in it, and can feel that we're all advancing the same agenda, even though we're all playing a very different part in the ecosystem. So we think a lot about what are the different roles in that we each play. And I think I'll end it there. And I made it in 15 minutes. So I thought I'd like to invite the panelists and our moderator up front to start taking their seats. We're lucky to have a great panel of guests who will share their own experiences and perspectives about this work. And as they come up, I'll point out that in your program, you have their names and their pictures. So as they're speaking, you can help identify them. So we're not going to do, and their bios are in there, so we're not going to take time with introductions. But Lillian Maldonado French is the superintendent of Mountain View School District. So she's representing the school district perspective. Shannon Wilkins is our representative from the LA County Office of Education. Kristen Sakota is here from the LA County Arts Commission. Dave Mitchell is representing the LA County Probation Department. And Carolyn Kaneko is here with us from the LA County Department of Mental Health. Alex Johnson is moderating the panel. And just briefly, Alex was appointed by Supervisor Mark Ridley Thomas to serve as a board member on the LA County Office of Education. He serves as a board member to the Arts for Incarcerated Youth Network. He is new to his position as a program officer at the Wellness Foundation, and he also sits on the Arts Ed Collective Leadership Council. So probably no one better prepared or suited to moderate this panel than Alex. So I'm going to turn it over to you. Welcome.
Good morning. Let me just thank Denise and Wendy and Angel for their leadership. I was asked to make some prefatory remarks, and I was sitting here thinking that the person I also need to thank is Janice Pober, who has gotten me, where's Janice? It's in large part because of her guidance. Janice and I have had a special relationship that's been one of friendship, one of mentoring, one of maternal a relationship that I've had with Janice, and she has gotten me involved in the Arts for Incarcerated Youth Network and the Arts Ed Leadership Council. And so I just wanted to give her a special shout out and thank her for everything. I'm a recovery attorney. So if there are any recovery attorneys in the audience, you know what that means. And I will say from a personal reflection standpoint, my arts experience was the sum of a couple of things. Was experiences with my parents and my sister at Barnsdall Art Park, was having to sit in the waiting room while my sister went and practiced and danced at Lula Washington Dance Theater. It was actually, and I'll admit this, in this audience, there's photos that you will never see. It was me taking ballet and tap when I was a kid. You will never see those photos, so let's not ask. And it was two teachers, Mark Monarch and Patrick Slattery, who were a music teacher and an arts teacher who really help to instill and uplift. And obviously, as I said, Janice, who has really accelerated my engagement in this area. This is such an important conversation. It's a conversation that is really looking at the intersection of arts, of education, of equity, in our most critical systems of care, our education system, our foster youth system, our probation system and system of youth justice, and just these systems that address and are working with our most vulnerable young people. In so many ways, these systems, if we are honest and truthful, have historically been undergirded by inequity. And it has been permeated by generational inequity that has overwhelmingly impacted communities of color. And nowhere has this disproportionality been more apparent and more striking than in the school to prison pipeline. Some might call it the cradle to prison pipeline. And I think we all know what that means. The school to prison pipeline is a set of policies and practices that have oftentimes favored incarceration over education, punishment over rehabilitation, and reinforced zero tolerance policies disproportionately push students, homeless students, foster youth students, students of color, students who are at the margins out of classrooms and into, in many instances, our camps and our halls. The school to prison pipeline has often started when student behavior is addressed in a manner that is disproportionate to the offending act, symptomatic in many ways of instances of unaddressed trauma and the need for healing. The arts, however, creates an off-ramp, creates a pathway from the pipeline by engaging young people and empowering them. I say this often, that arts is not a distraction, but it can be a diversionary tool. It's a tool, it's a practice for young people to heal, to tell their stories through a variety of mediums, through spoken word, through dance, through poetry, through performance, through visual pieces, to imagine their boundless and infinite possibilities, to anchor them to their own history and their culture. Art has the transformative power to heal and to channel creativity, to build up strong youth. And there are so many examples of organizations who are using arts to do this. I saw Bob smiling in there out in the audience from Inner City Arts. There's New Earth, there's Artworks LA, Spirit Awakening, Inside Out Writers, Arts for Incarcerated Youth Network, the list goes on and on. Art and arts education, therefore, should not be optional. It must be fundamental to a student's learning and a student's matriculation as they travel through the education system. We have equality, but it is incumbent on us to drive deeper towards equity in arts education. We must go deeper. We have to ensure that those who are most in need receive arts. And we need philanthropy to serve as a bridge and a partner in identifying and implementing and scaling solutions for achieving scale and equity in arts. So with that, I want to transition into this really amazing panel, this cross-section of leaders, and I'm going to try to make the transition to pick up my mic and still speak. This cross-section of leaders are doing just some tremendous work in arts and arts education. And so I want to start with, is it on? Can you hear me? I want to start with two of our education partners. We have the Superintendent of the Year, Lillian Maldonado French, who is here. We have Shannon, give her a round of applause. We have Shannon Wilkins from the LA County Office of Education, who is here. And I want to start with them to really begin this conversation. And so Lillian, I want you to give us a sense of how your school district has been working to advance arts and arts education throughout your district.
Great, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. And I have to say, I have to agree with the commentary that Denise made. Arts education has never really gone away. And in fact, during the deepest recession, the one thing we did not lose was our phenomenal band program. It's amazing. But it did begin in 4th grade. And so what we had was some arts education for some students. And so we began this journey really the way we focus all of our work, and that is thinking about the whole child and in creating systems of support and integrating, because that's really the only way we can do our work, because we don't have enough funding to have separate programs. So we have to think holistically, and we have to think, how do we connect? So whether it's an amazing summer program that we have for students, or increasing wellness opportunities for our students, whether it's healthcare or family engagement, we try everything together. So everything is about arts, everything is about summer learning, everything is about everything. And the other little thing I like to add is that I always start with incremental steps. So I have a saying that everyone knows in our district, that every year just a little bit more. So you have to start out with knowing that you have, take one step at a time and then grow the program. But I have to say the initial seed was critical, and that is that we received a grant, and we were able to get a coach who took us through a strategic planning process. And with that planning process, we were able to be very intentional about our funding that was referenced earlier. LCAP funding was an accelerator for us. Any kind of additional grant monies, any grants that we received from the Arts Commission, we're able to incorporate it and integrate it into what was already a plan in place. And the other accelerator was a program, TEAL, and you'll hear more about TEAL in a minute, but it's technology enhanced art. So we had 3 coaches in our district, and they trained 120 teachers in our district, and that continues to grow and grow and grow. The other important part of this our program was bringing in art specialists. Having that artist in residence coming to our school not only sparked the interest in the arts for our students, but also for our teachers. Having the TEAL program is fantastic because the teachers are able to learn lessons online, but having access to that artist who comes, we just had a training last week where the artist comes and gives an in-person opportunity for our teachers, is ultimately how one experiences the arts. So giving our teachers the opportunity to experience the arts themselves created that spark of joy and initiative and wanting to create more. So it's been very intentional looking at what resources we had in our community as well, using a scope and sequence of looking at the arts, providing a variety of opportunities by grade level through our artists and residents, and then making sure that we're incorporating and integrating into every program possible. So whether it's language arts or social studies or whatever opportunity exists, our physical education program is infused with the arts. So just finding those ways of including the arts into our students' lives is how we do it.
Thank you. There are a couple of points that you raised. One talking about the whole child, one talking about how adults respond to the arts that I want to come back to and I want our panelists to be thinking about. But let me bring Shannon into the conversation. So the county Office of Education and the local school district, Mountain View, 2 different roles, but the county has an important role, the local school districts have an important role. Can you tell us, Shannon, about what's the county's role in arts education, the County Office of Education's role in arts education?
It's at the bottom.
Is it on? Oh,
Yes.
great. Thank you. Well, good morning, everyone. I'm happy to be part of this panel and talk about my favorite topic, so glad to be here. Our charge at the County Office of Education is to support the 80 school districts in our charters with curriculum and instruction and assessment. And to that order, when it comes to arts education, we have really been what I consider to be in a renaissance ever since Common Core standards came in. And that was really, they came in 2010. Denise alluded to what happened in No Child Left Behind, which was really intended to give kids a good solid foundation of skills But it was organized as hundreds of discrete skills. And so kids were having trouble using those skills and applying them. So the Common Core state standards came in, and there were fewer standards, but they were deeper and more interconnected, and children needed to do things with them. So that was really a critical moment in time for us at Los Angeles County Office of Education to provide some new guidance to our districts. And the question is, so what does instruction look like now that everything has changed? So we wrote our view of what we thought instruction should be and what the role that arts education should be through a series called Teaching Creativity with Common Core State Standards. And we were astounded by the number of people that were coming to, we held it in a huge hall at the Huntington Library. And the first several years, it was not only educators, it was the museums, and it was the music centers, and it was the theaters, because everybody needed to retool for what was happening for this sea change. So it was delightful, and it was a face-to-face exchange, but then we needed to grow it even more broadly. So my colleagues in the Center for Distance and Online Learning took that notion of arts integration, which was our pedagogical construction. And what that really is, it means that you take art standards and you say, I'm going to teach these things in visual arts, and you lay it next to something that you're teaching in a different content area. And you present those side by side as a vehicle for teaching both, and kids getting more out of it because they also had an art experience to help go through different channels to learn that information. So my colleagues took that pedagogical structure and turned it into an online technology, along with a very good trainer of trainer program, so that schools would have an in-house resident expert that will be working with their own colleagues. So this has continued. We were thrilled to say that we did get a Golden Bell Award for the series, and thrilled with how it has been expanded. And now our secondary colleagues are really knocking on our doors saying, so what about us? How does arts integration, or does arts integration look like something that is important for secondary students? So once again, we're really at the forefront of saying, well, secondary does look different, because in high schools, as we all remember, every 55 minutes you change classes to a teacher who is an expert in their field. There isn't that interconnection that's so much more easily facilitated in K-6 education, because it's the same teacher all day long. So trying to find a way that we can move the arts into other content areas, being respectful of their content, which is dense and deep, but making it, making an environment that arts is making learning in every field more achievable and more equitable. So let me give you an example of what that might look like. On Friday, we were working with what I consider to be one of the most difficult challenges for high school students, Shakespeare. So we were working with Romeo and Juliet, and I'm sure a good number of you have worked with Romeo and Juliet in your own high school experience. It's arguably the greatest love story ever told, and quite a woman's lib too, with that Juliet. But it is written in Old English. It's set in Renaissance Verona, which is not exactly anybody's cultural experience. And it's dense and difficult to read. Would you agree with that? So, except for English majors love it, right? And they're good at it. So I think you have to develop it. So we were with a good number of English teachers, but the problem is that isn't as accessible to everyone, particularly English language learners or children with disabilities. This is kind of very dense content. So we added ballet and music to that same content, and suddenly there's a lot more vehicles to learn the story of Romeo and Juliet. Of course, ballet has no language at all, but when you watch the Royal Ballet dance it, you get the story, all of it. And of course, Tchaikovsky's theme and Prokofiev's theme. These are all different vehicles for teaching the same content, which enhances what their content is anyway, but makes it accessible and equitable. So we're really just at kind of the beginning stages of working with our secondary colleagues in other contents, and then we'll be blending that with our single subject art teachers in the high schools as well.
Thank you, Shannon, and thank you for pointing out how you use that in terms of working with English language learners. I think that's a really important point to note. I want to bring in Carolyn to the conversation. Lillian was talking about this notion of the whole child. And as one who believes firmly that we ought to be investing in the whole child, the continuum of work, it's something that is central to the work that you're doing at DMH. So tell us why is DMH involved in the arts? What is DMH doing around the arts, and how are you leveraging it?
Okay, I started my career as a school-based mental health professional, and the arts and play were the vehicles for me to communicate with the students. Sometimes, a lot of the work that we do as therapists is really reaching the affect and those feelings, and sometimes it's hard for first grader to even a high school student to talk about what's going on. And so I've used the arts in really breaking down the stigma and the barriers, and to help them communicate what's going on. So that's on a micro level. But on a macro level, the department recognizes the importance of art in the community. If you remember, we had the Why We Rise event in May, where we really brought in the visual and performing arts in a new way, and the importance of messaging and awareness and mental health awareness. So I think that's where we're really moving towards that prevention piece. We're really good about providing services, but what can we do to move more upstream to prevent people coming into our services or into any of the systems? So we're looking really at prevention. We're looking at early intervention, helping teachers and the community members recognize early signs, so we can provide treatment on this front end. So it really does, so that child's trajectory doesn't get impeded by, some of the challenges that currently are going on today.
Let me pose this. So a lot of, when I talk to young people, they are dealing with a range of trauma, whether it's in the household, whether it's just navigating their daily lives. And so Lillian, you can speak to this. Dave, one of the things that numbers I hear cited often, 94% of the young people in our probation camps and halls are dealing with trauma. So Carolyn, Dave, Lillian, how is trauma, how is preventing trauma, addressing trauma, how is that part of the work you all are doing as relates to the arts in your various departments? And Dave, you jump in a moment as well.
Funny you should ask that, because Monday of this week, we had about over 70 schools, districts, counselors, professionals in this very room, because we are part of a collaborative working with Los Angeles County Office of Education, UCLA, and DMH to really bring trauma-informed information and resiliency training to all the schools. So that is our charge this year, is to really bring that information from the school to the school administrators and superintendents all the way down to the teachers. So that's why I love TEAL, SEL, social emotional learning. I love SPORT, which is suicide prevention online resiliency training, because that's the only way we could really reach and disseminate this important information to LA County, which is the 5th largest state, the 12th largest country. When you think about that span, how else can we reach and build equitable access?
And I'll jump in here. Alex alluded to 94% of our youth have suffered some sort of trauma in the probation system. And one of the things I talked earlier about with my colleague from DMH is when we get them in probation, it's not only trauma, but a lot of times it's untreated trauma. We have the disconnected youth who, for various reasons, family support, education deficiencies, gang influence, various issues create a situation where these kids have not been treated, and they come into our system, and really delinquency is symptomatic of untreated issues with kids and families. And we really have to emphasize the family. And when we talk about trauma, we try to see trauma through the same lens. One of the things we've done with the arts is we've trained our staff with their staff. They've trained us on the arts, we've trained them on trauma. So any adult working with our kids in the system sees the kids through the same lens. It's so important, and we've trained LACO, and we've trained DMH, and we've trained our health services, because it's so important when dealing with trauma that everyone deals with the youth consistently, effectively, and understands the trauma and how to effectively mitigate some of those symptoms. So we also participate in multidisciplinary team planning, where all partners are together again. And DMH may help us with identifying some of the underlying issues, but we create a plan that will not only deal with the trauma while they're with us, but when they go to the community. Camps, probation are not panaceas for what ails these youth. They really get healthy in their own ecology in the community. So one of the things that we've worked strong with the arts is to connect kids to the arts when they leave our facilities. And one of the things I talked to Denise about for years is that we need to try to provide employable skills. If a kid has a propensity in the arts, that we have to get them on a path, either educationally or employment-wise, to get them in a field in the arts, because some of our kids are so talented. And you know, they use the arts as a catharsis for their trauma. They paint, they dance, you know, they do theater. We have an academic bowl tomorrow, which is just incredible. Our kids are very bright, but they haven't been treated effectively before they got to probation. So we want to stabilize them in our facilities, develop a plan that we can effectively treat them when they get back to their community, and support their family and in their natural ecology.
Lily, I want you to respond to that, and then I want to bring in Kristen to talk about how they are using the arts in an even wider perspective for prevention purposes with young people who have faced trauma in other instances. But Lily, why don't you respond?
I just want to point out that this is an issue that affects all students, and you may not have this awareness. I know that those of us who work in education are aware that the issue of trauma is endemic, I think, to our system. We have students who are K through 8, and on a weekly basis, we have students who are hospitalized on a 5150 weekly basis. And that's not counting the kids who we have the PMRT team come out and they decide that they're okay, or there's another intervention that's done. So this is a huge problem. We have counselors on each of our schools, all of our elementary, and now we're adding Masters of Social Work interns. Then we met with USC, and they said, listening to our issues on a scale of 1 to 4, with 4 being a crisis level, they think our system in our school and our community is a 3. So it's a huge issue.
So Lillian, just to dig a little deeper, how is, with your schools, how are they connecting the arts to help with the trauma, with those significant amount of young people who you're seeing being hospitalized, being referred to treatment? What is the arts, what are you using the arts to do?
So our counselors are are creating suicide prevention programs, anti-bullying programs, and looking at what are those deep issues that we can tackle more at a systemic level, and it is through the arts. So they're creating programs. Either we have different levels. So tier 1 is what we provide for all students. So our tier 1 programs include the arts as a way of expressing themselves and in a positive way, and learning new social skills, positive social skills, to deal with the trauma that they experience, and also to find other ways for them to communicate and not cause additional trauma to their fellow students.
Kristen?
Sure. So good morning, everyone. So at the Arts Commission, as a local arts agency, our primary role is really supporting arts and culture countywide, and ensuring that there's really deep sustainability and infrastructure to support arts and culture. and access and equity in the arts broadly. And we do that through many ways, but as you heard this morning, we are privileged to have spent the last 15 years or so growing a really robust area of work, body of work in arts education. So we're literally able to utilize arts education, and in partnership with so many of the folks in this room and so many of our nonprofit partners, as a means to not only supporting arts and culture, but supporting really health and well-being across the county. So specifically in relation to what we're talking about right now, I know one of the things that has been mentioned was that we were honored to be a recipient of the Art for Justice Fund initiative. And so if it's helpful, I can talk a little bit about that initiative and that body of work. So for those who, if you're not familiar with Art for Justice is a 5-year initiative that was launched recently by a wonderful philanthropist, art collector, and arts leader named Agnes Gund from New York, who is really an arts leader and a very strong supporter of arts education in her own right, and started a program called Studio in a School that brings artists into schools as partners in New York, and that's actually spreading nationally. Through her work and her personal life, became aware of the crisis of mass incarceration and the issue of racial disparities in the justice system. And it really was very personal to her in that she has 3 or 4 daughters, and through them now has a number of grandchildren who are African American. And she was starting to really feel this in her bones, and spent time researching, reading, having folks advise her to become more critically aware. And she said, we need to do something about this. So she comes from an arts background. So she went to her colleagues at the Ford Foundation, Darren Walker, and said, what could I do? Well, what she did is she took one of her own beloved paintings from her personal art collection, which was a Lichtenstein, very valuable piece, sold it at auction for $165 million. And after dealing with the proceeds and other things and costs, launched a $100 million 5-year initiative called Art for Justice that is investing in both art strategies and criminal reform strategies, both separate, equal, combined, any permutation. So in that work and being part of that cohort of national grantees, but there are several who are here in LA County as well. Some partners have been mentioned today, Arts for Incarcerated Youth Network or Tia Chucha, California Lawyers for the Arts. Everyone in that cohort is working in their own way to utilize the arts or criminal reform strategies to reduce mass incarceration and really advance narrative change as well around our youth. So for us, this work began with the broader arts education and arts, the idea that arts should be for all. In that work, we began to work with probation and others in the county when the LA model and Camp Kilpatrick was coming online, right? And that's where the conversation began. So through that work and that partnership, we've been able to coordinate and fund arts instruction for incarcerated youth. Now with the opportunity of this grant and the moment, which really gave us a chance to think bigger and say, what is our real vision for this work in the next few years? We see an opportunity to not only be investing in youth who are incarcerated currently, thinking about their reentry in community, but also, as folks have mentioned, going upstream. What does diversion look like if there's an arts-based strategy in it? What does prevention look like, and how do we use evidence-based to say, we know that youth and communities that are touched by any of these systems, foster systems or others, there's a very high correlation there. So can we look at communities that have been under-resourced, communities that have a high proportion of systems involved youth and communities, and infuse them with arts instruction, infuse them with creative youth development as a means of prevention? Also, are there opportunities for youth employment? And along the way, we may commission an artist or two to do some great work supporting narrative change. So we will be coordinating, and Denise will be instrumental in this work, an interagency task force to help align who's utilizing the arts, encourage those who perhaps aren't yet, and think about systemic ways to integrate the arts into this work, into family engagement through the foster system, right, into schools, embedding, and actually we're working with mental health on communities' wellness and how trauma-informed training can perhaps be shared with the arts organizations and community-based organizations, and the arts be embedded there. So I would just say in all of this, I think our real opportunity, and interesting for us in reflecting broadly on the role of the local arts agency, is to realize that we sit as what I like to call an inside-outsider position. The arts are often viewed as as sort of an outsider or commenting or, as sort of, but really we're also deeply on the inside, and that's a critical opportunity to really advance systemic change for positive good as we look at not only prevention, but the arc of justice reinvestment and investing those dollars and that attention in a positive way, including through the arts in communities and in youth. So that's the big picture.
Kristen, you said there are a lot of great nuggets to take from what you just said. I want to pick up on one, and it's really arts as a force for systemic change. And I want to call out the LA model and ask Dave to describe, first of all, what the LA model is. We've heard a lot about the LA model in a lot of different spaces. What is the LA model? But more specifically, how are arts embedded and integrated into the LA model? And how has that led to change, to cultural change, and to systemic change in the probation department?
Okay, the LA model is a true collaborative that started 5 or 6 years ago with the probation department, CBOs, county partners, advocates, developing a system of custody and control and changing it to a system of care. And we had everyone at the table as we developed this and created these tenets of what the LA model should be. What does care mean when you're dealing with probation youth in a facility? One of our true advantages is we used to have 2,000 kids in our camp. Today we have 260. And Campus Kilpatrick was built as a model for a system of care. It's holistic, small family, home-like setting where they have their own living room. They live in groups of 6 kids. They have their own living room. They do their own laundry. They get to wear their own clothes. Our staff don't wear uniforms. And really, the LA model is, the tenets are, it's how do the adults in that kid's life interface with these kids on an ongoing basis. And one of the things we did purposely, we planned together. It wasn't probation taking the lead. It was all of us taking the lead. We talked about systems. We talked about what could impact these youth in the future. And the arts were at the table from the beginning. And we talked about how we can incorporate the arts, not only into Campus Kilpatrick, but into all of our facilities. And I'm proud to say we currently have the Arts for Incarcerated Youth in every one of our juvenile facilities, our halls and camps. And 5 years ago, that wouldn't have happened in probation. And it's because of the insistency of people like Denise and Kylie, that were at the table, said this is very important. And we need to expose our kids to different ideas, to different concepts. We need to give them a vehicle that allows them to act out their trauma in a positive way. And you would be shocked to see these kids' skills in singing, in the theater, and they're incredible artists. And this allows them to, instead of fight, to use that energy in a different way. And what was beautiful about what we did, when we did the 4-week training, when we opened Kilpatrick, we had our artists in that training. We had our therapists, we had our nurses, we had our teachers. Everyone took the same training that was trauma-based, but also talked about DBT, talked about the arts. The arts trained us also. So it was very holistic in our approach. And so we all see these kids through the same lens. We all treat them the same way. We understand what they do and why they do it. What are their triggers? If you're in an art class and a kid starts to go off and you have an understanding of those triggers, you're going to be much more effective as an artist. The other thing we did was we incorporated them into our case planning. We have a full-time resident artist at Kilpatrick. We're going to have one at Dorothy Kirby Center. They sit down and conduct multidisciplinary teams with us. They have an art plan for this kid when they leave the community, for those kids who want to continue on with the arts. So it's very holistic in our planning, in our transition planning, because like I said earlier, the real work happens back in the community. We can do a lot of things when we have a captive audience, but when the community, when the kid's back in the community with those forces that created, some of the situations from the beginning, how does he or she respond to that? What type of support does he have? Those artists are often one of their highest support systems, both at our facilities and in the community. There's a connection, a positive adult connection. The last thing I want to say is the artists have been incredible for our staff because we wanted our staff to interact with kids differently. And we train in drumming, we train in art, and we do different things. So our staff see these kids through a different lens. Our staff know that art is a vehicle to allow them to express themselves positively.
Thank you, Dave. I want to pose a question because one of the narratives that's being lifted up is really this systems change in agencies that have not traditionally worked in the arts, right? And even Lillian, when it comes to school districts, the arts has not always been as the data shows, given what Denise has talked about with respect to how the landscape of arts education has taken time to develop and to embed. It's taken to work to convince adults to embed the arts, to use the arts, to leverage the arts for systems change, for justice reinvestment, as you said, Kristen. So tell us, what's the story of that? What did it take? What strategies did you use, or did the department use to make the shift? Whether it's Dave, Carolyn, Lillian, whomever, just curious about what skills, what tactics were used to make those shifts, to make that turn, so that arts was at the core of much of the work that you're doing.
I think we in probation needed to accept that we're going to be different in the future. And that was and from the administration down, our role is different. Our role, as a probation officer is different than it used to be. We must be systemically involved. We must understand the systems as a whole, and we must work with other agencies because our outcomes weren't good. And the worst thing we could do is re-traumatize kids. And that's what we are doing by incarcerating too many youth. We were re-traumatizing them. So I think as an organization for the last 5 or 6 years, I've seen the cultural change and the cultural shift that we have to engage the community. We have to engage our partners. And that took a lot for the department to understand that our role is different now. The other thing is the training, the cross-training, and allowing people in your house. I mean, it's very uncomfortable sometimes to allow people in your house to train together, to develop partnerships. Our CBOs need to be our partners. Our mental health partner needs to be our partner. Our LACO partner, we have to be one. We have to be youth-centric in the way we act, the way we deal with youth on an ongoing basis. LACO and probation should never be at odds when it comes to youth. We should both see them the same way. We may have different tactics, styles, but the end goal should always be the same. And that took a lot for probation to let people in our house.
Carolyn, Kristen, Lillian?
I think there's so much stigma when it comes to the Department of Mental Health. We recognize that we have all these services that we have to offer, but people weren't coming to our doors. So I think we have recognized, especially in the last 8 years, of really changing the focus on, we'll still have our services, but really looking out into the community and working with faith-based communities and community-based organizations and partners to really bring us to the table, to the community, and to kind of help us to educate and inform the partners out there. I think arts really offers an opportunity for hope, as I'm listening to everyone here, arts is hope. Arts give hope to that individual and to the families. And so I think we're really trying to move away from the walls of the department. So we're in Parks and Rec, we're in libraries, we're in a lot of different places where families and people naturally gather. And so that's kind of where we're pushing the envelope there.
I think for us, it was two things. The first is that we've had a partnership with the Arts Commission for a while, and we had opportunities to receive grants so that students had field trips or different things. But when the Arts Commission switched their focus and funded a coach to be able to have strategic planning, that made the difference. Because then we started thinking, okay, well, what is the systemic integration of the arts? And then the second thing I have to say, it's funding. If we had not switched to a different funding system in the state of California, which is the LCAP or the LCFF, which provided us an opportunity to have more opportunities to think about and choose how we were going to spend our funding and receive more funding. Our district is 97% free and reduced and or English learner. So those funds, which are equity funds, were what we were able to use to do that. So it really is about funding.
I wanted to add just that I think there are a lot of really dynamic leaders right now in organizations, in departments, in agencies, folks who are really looking at doing the work, folks who are really interested in being innovative, in looking ahead. And I think that is really greasing the wheels and helping things move forward. But I also really want to say part of the focus on the systemic, on something that's policy-based, on something that's institutionalized, is because if that dynamic leader leaves, we don't want things to fall backwards, right? This can't all rest on one dynamic leader. And I'm thinking specifically about a story that Denise will tell where, you know, we sat down for a meeting, this is before my time, sat down for like a couple years ago, sat down for a meeting with probation when the arts were kind of first coming up and said, okay, and everyone, you know, on our side was sort of prepared to give all the reasons why the arts were so important and you should have arts education, and that they actually said, stop. We don't need to hear why. We're ready to hear how. They were ready to move. And that's incredible. But we can't waste this opportunity thinking that we can rely on the shoulders of a dynamic leader or dynamic leadership that could potentially change in a different generation or in a different sort of cast of leaders. So the policy and the systems change, I think, is really critical to set these wheels in motion. And I will just say on a macro level, for everybody working in the arts and in arts philanthropy, I think, over the last several years, there are some major shifts that are really happening in our field that we've been evolving into. One of them might be the shift from, first of all, into explicitly, again, it's sort of perennial, but talking about diversity, and then how that has begun to shift into talking about equity and inclusion. And then once you start thinking about, well, what does that look like? And if you're talking about arts education, you might think, okay, the public schools, it's the most democratic way of reaching everyone, but then what does equity really look like? And then you might say, what about the youth that's incarcerated in the camps? Aren't they in the education system too, right? So how that is manifest, I think, is also a really big part of what's happening in the arts and in arts philanthropy broadly. Arts education, no exception. And then I'll also say galvanizing all of this or undergirding all of this is the increasing recognition on all sides that the arts have such incredible intrinsic value. They also have such incredible value and impact across. So taking a page from our colleagues in health equity, right? How do we do sort of not just health in all policies, but arts in all policies? How do we help support those strategies? And so that's also something at a macro level that's happening. And that means that colleagues in other departments are saying, oh yeah, this actually, and believing that it isn't something fluff. And this is happening globally when we talk to leaders in municipal government in London, in New York, in everywhere, that they too are also understanding that the arts, whether it be arts education, arts in education, arts in community development, arts in well-being, actually have such rich value.
So I was going to ask a question about the challenges, but before I get to that and how folks can help support your work, But before I get to that, I mean, you raised an interesting point, and as I look across and think about this panel, you're all at either county agencies or you're at school district leaders change, budgets change, the folks who are helping to drive the work will change. So how do you make sure that this work stays embedded, that art stays embedded and institutionalized as a part of the core, that the current partnership and interagency partnership stays together? Like, what is needed, whether it's community pressure, et cetera, what is needed to make sure that that happens?
I'll take a stab at this. I think one of the things that I've talked and with our partners in the arts is collecting data. We have to have data that what we're doing works. We have to connect youth in the community. The other thing is the funding. Currently, probation pays for our arts in our facilities, but it's state funding, you know, and it's based on state budgets. It changes, leaders change, you know, so you have to be able to, and then the other thing is institutionalize their partnership with you, whether it's through policy or practice. You know, having the arts at the MDTs is institutionalizing that. Having full-time artists, you know, ultimately we should have a full-time artist at every one of our facilities and use that to institutionalize a way of doing business, because once it's been practiced for years, it has a greater chance of surviving in tough budget times.
Where we are right now, Denise talked about, we have new standards that just got approved this month for last time that happened was 18 years ago. So that's a big change that everybody in arts education, no matter if you're within the system or if you are working supporting the system in the community, will need to retool over. The standards are the content of what is being taught. And I think there's two things that I love about these new standards. The first is that they're based on the National Core Art Standards, which means that there's a national view of what a good arts education consists of. And that really levels the playing field for college and career readiness as our students matriculate into either a career or into higher education, that they come to universities with some consistency. I think that's very important. And then I think the biggest, most important thing is that we have a fifth discipline now, which is media arts. That, you know, 18 years ago, we were not producing a lot of digitally created art. And of course now, I mean, the music industry, I mean, we're right here in the heart of everything in Los Angeles County. The creative industry is enormous. And so having those media arts be part of our new content standards, I think will go a long way in making, you know, the workers for the, you know, the next jobs as they matriculate. But it also gives all of us a challenge to educate ourselves on, so what are those new standards? And in 2020, we're going to get the new framework. So the standards are just the content and the framework is the how. That one will be thick. These standards are thin. So that'll be a challenge for everybody in arts education.
Kristen?
I wanted to pick up on something mentioned here about the strategic plan. I mean, I think one thing that has been learned is that if something isn't in a district strategic plan, it often will fall by the wayside. So just like, you know, policy and practice, getting arts education into those strategic plans or into policy, whether that be at the local level, at the district level, at the state or federal level, so that the value of arts education is really embedded, because those things, as we know, can last for decades and influence and really kind of roll out from there. On the funding side, I would also just say, you know, everybody in this room in some way in their actions or their is sort of enacting policy and sort of valued decisions in a way by what you're funding or by what you're supporting. And so I think also everybody collectively is working. And for us, we've had just an amazing opportunity to not do this work, you know, recognize we don't do this work in a silo, and actually begin to formalize that in the form of the Arts Ed Collective, which began, I believe, almost about 15 years it's been or so now, right? And I see Janice nodding. She's like, yes, yes. And so what that does is also put into practice in a more formal way a collective opportunity collaboratively to come to the table, both in funding and in leadership and thought partnership around the table with LACO, with private philanthropy, et cetera. And so moving that forward as, again, a vehicle that can live beyond any one person. And I think on the funding side, I also just think, there's a movement also in sort of the grant world that talks about like full cost sort of grant making, full cost projects, where basically if you're giving grants to a nonprofit organization, are you actually taking into account how much it really costs for them to administer the program, or are you just leading by saying this is the kind of program I want to fund, but not actually supporting its true operation or the sustainability of that nonprofit, even though they're key to that community? And I think in some ways we have a mirror happening here with the arts. How do we begin to see that arts is core to education? And that means it's core to the full cost of administering education. It's not a side piece, right? And same thing with other aspects of our work. So that's what I see as sort of how to move things forward from our point of view.
Lillian?
I just want to add exactly the same thing, that it has to be embedded into those key documents that are in whatever organization that is. For us, it's our board policies, it's our LCAP plan, which is our district plan for funding, which ultimately becomes the budget. So if it's in the budget and if it's in the core plan, it's in the school plans, then it will happen. So strategic planning is very, very important. So it's not left to in case someone wants to do it, but it's part of what we have to do.
So before we jump to audience questions, I just want to get quick responses in terms of the challenges. So each of you, your work has been really expanding the tent for arts education, making sure that it is core to all students, not just those who have some privilege, but all students. But what are the challenges that you are seeing, the greatest challenges? 30, 45-second responses so we can get to audience questions. But what are you seeing as the greatest challenges?
I think getting the arts back into everybody's mindset and part of the practice of this is what we do in this school. This is part of our school, and it's not something that we do occasionally. Having that be part of the culture of the school, I think has been a big challenge. I see progress, but I think we're going to have to do a little more.
For me, the challenge is not being person-driven, but systems-driven. We have 10 facilities and 3 juvenile halls that we have the arts at, and sometimes how successful we are based on the people involved in those projects, the director at that facility, and it really needs to be valued by both and all parties so that it's not person-driven. It really is a valued product at that facility.
I would say one challenge which relates, is advancing arts education as a sort of piece of advocacy, that it's an equity issue, and that it's a social justice issue. And embedded within that is the notion of cultural relevancy as well, and cultural inclusion. So really reflecting that a lot of the talents of these youth, et cetera, are actually valued. They're not something to be criminalized or set aside because they're not reflected in a specific canon. Sorry, I digress, but I think that's actually really important. And then the systemic piece, and then thirdly, funding. I mean, even from my point of view, that I mean, if I had it at my fingertips, I would be infusing even more funding to the CBOs and nonprofits who really help undergird well-being in our schools and our communities.
I think from a Department of Mental Health standpoint, I think it's always a challenge because funding changes and shifts. We have had an influx of prevention and early intervention funding, which allowed us to support a lot of programming with LA Arts Commission and LACO. So one of those being TEAL, SELs, infusing social emotional learning in TEAL, as well as school-based informed healing arts education, which is really bringing the arts that was happening in the juvenile justice system and bringing that program out to 3 high schools. But it's really making sure that those partnerships, those relationships that we developed during times of funding rich times continue to stay and foster. Because in times when we don't have the funding, those are the relationships are what will continue and what will forge projects through.
And I think I'll continue on the theme, but what you're hearing is that the funding for arts is unstable because funding for education is unstable. And sounds like funding for mental health or for everything else. And I'm not sure the typical Californian understands how much our funding fluctuates from year to year. And continuing to have strong programs is truly a challenge. And that, I think, is our biggest challenge.
Thank you. We want to, first of all, give our panelists a huge round of applause. And we have about 15 to 20 minutes for questions. There's a mic that will be roving around. And so if you have a question, just make the universal signal, raise your hand. We have a question right there. If you could state your name, where you're from, and then pose your question, please.
Oh, hold off.
One sec,
We have
let's
some
get
folks
you the mic.
participating via webinar, so if you'll wait for the mic, that's the only way they can hear us.
Okay.
And I'll just take this one quick moment to remind them to mute themselves. Thank you.
Jim Herr with the Annenberg Foundation. With the governor wanting to move the juvenile justice system out of corrections and into social service agencies within the government, what do you see as the effect at the local level here in Los Angeles County? And what are things that we should be supporting in this effort? What are things that we should not be supporting? And are there any potential pitfalls that you see coming up with this?
Great question. Who wants to start with that? Dave?
Yeah, I'll start with that. It'll be interesting to see how they align, and obviously it's at the inception stages. But I think in LA County, we've done a lot of that work already. I mean, probation is aligned with mental health, and you know, the health and mental health are combining, and we're much more into the health-related services in LA County and partnering with those agencies. Then I think we're ahead of the curve on that. I could see us falling right in line with that philosophy, and my gut feeling is the funding is going to fall in line with that also. So you're almost going to be forced to it at a local level, but I think what's good about LA County is we're progressive, and we already do that work in that vein. And you know, we meet with mental health is tied at the hip with us, health services tied at the hip, our CBOs, partners, you know, that really should be the model. And I think the state is kind of late to the ball game, in my opinion.
Anyone else want to respond to that? I would just say that the import of the governor's potential action is that, you know, DJJ, even though the population has decreased significantly, the funding has increased. Same goes for CDCR. I often say, you know, as CDCR, California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, we have increased funding for our punitive systems. At the same time, we've seen a significant drop in the population over the past 3, 4, 5 years. And so the import of that is that I think it's an opportunity for those dollars to be redirected and shifted into areas such as the arts, education, mental health services, things that we know work and that are preventative for young people from even going into the systems in the first place. And the second thing I would say is that we can't view the governor's action with respect to DJJ separate and apart from the governor's push for early childhood education. We need to look at those as connected as a continuum and build a continuum so young people can thrive. That starts at early ed and ends when they've got a job, when they're on the pathway to college or career. And so I think it's an important step by the governor, and I hope that it's something that happens. Great question.
Can I just
Kristen.
say one little touch on that too, which is just, I also hope that, you know, sometimes signals of value or philosophy shift are actually important. And so if that helps sort of engender others to look differently at their systems, I think that's helpful. I also was very interested in his sort of platform around early childhood education and wonder if we will see a full kind of universal pre-K push. And then of course, our job is to also think about arts education in there. So, you know, having that come forward. And then just also on the justice piece that, you know, there are a lot of advocates and others who are also have been watching for a while now the shift into essentially community supervision and different forms of that digital and others, and so the growth of that. So also just meaning, just because it's not necessarily concentrated in a physical facility doesn't mean the system is gone. And so what is that also starting to look like as we sort of evolve forward? And I know a lot of, criminal justice reform advocates are looking at that.
Thank you. Other question?
Jennifer Lewisell with the Motion Picture Television Fund and the Actors Fund. And my question is, you talked a lot about trauma, and a lot of times children that have trauma come from parents that have long-term trauma, and that is a huge problem. So we're healing these children, or trying to heal these children, but the parents still have these traumas, so they're going home to these people that have trauma. The question is, has anything been done to bring the parents in? These parents are working, obviously, but bring these parents into night art courses with these children to make sure, or weekends, some way to make sure that the parents or the people that are in charge of these children can see how great this makes this child feel, so that they can start to shift their perspective in their life.
I'd like to start. We have a very, very robust family engagement program, and it begins with families and then grows to have them be the experts to reach out to other families. So that's for how we support them, whether it's through education, or whether it's how child development classes, whatever it is that the family needs. When dealing with family trauma and a child in trauma, it never really works if you're just working on the one child. It's a family issue, and so the whole family needs to go to counseling, or so we engage the entire family. And family is whoever their family is. It's often not mom and dad. So whoever is there in the home is part of that solution, part of that support. But in terms of our family engagement, they're very much a part of everything we do, and part of the arts program as well. So yes.
Just to reiterate, even though the child is the identified patient, you can't change that child in that 50-minute hour. So we have to engage the family. And what's neat about what's happening in the last few years or so is that we are going into the homes now. We've expanded our clinic hours to meet the needs of the working parent, because we know that there's intergenerational trauma that's happening, which really impacts that. Additionally, there's an infusion of in-home school-based, infant home visitation, which impacts 2 generations and sometimes 3. And so that's where really department is investing in those practices and those community-based practices that work. So we recognize a lot of
Are there arts programs with the parents?
Yes, a lot of the evidence-based practices that the Department of Mental Health uses has an arts component and a group component, where they bring, maybe the parents are in one group, the children in another group, and then they come together. And we recognize the arts is often the way to kind of bring that and bring those languages, right, those age groups together into one common thing. So it is infused in a lot of our evidence-based practices.
This is a challenge for probation because our facilities are very remote. So for our incarcerated youth, it's a huge challenge of parent engagement. DMH does provide transportation, and we get a lot of parents come up, but not to the degree they need to be involved. And that's why I alluded to earlier, we in the community, we have a lot of home-based services. We utilize MST, functional family therapy, wraparound services. And that's why I said, unless you're engaging the family as part of the solution and treating the family, you're not going to be successful. So that is one of our challenges in our institution, is getting parents up to our facilities, because they could be placed 100 miles from their house.
And there are nonprofits across the county that have family engagement as part of their arts education or their arts activities. Many of them very well may be funded by the Arts Commission through our main grant programs, but looking at it at a sort of systemic kind of intervention is something that we hope to look at actually in this work in the next near future.
Question right here. Ms.
Yeah,
Fleischer.
I'm Dorothy Fleischer with the Keck Foundation. As you were talking about policy, and I'm thinking about the opportunity of the LA County Regional Plan for Arts Education that's going to go to the board, where do you envision, and I know there's opportunity for input, but to what extent is that plan focused on the arts? Is it focused on integration across some of the systems that the county has to say? I'm just wondering, where is the leverage in re-envisioning that plan?
Kristen and Shannon, Kristen, want to start?
I will just say, great question, and in some ways remains to be seen, but absolutely is a really big opportunity for everyone who touches this work whatsoever or is impacted by this work to look at this as a vehicle for talking about the evolution and what we think will help us achieve scale and equity. I was just saying this morning in a meeting that when I arrived to this role, I looked at the existing plan, the prior plan, which is from the 90s, because we were talking about how we're going to update. I thought, well, let me see what it says. And it did actually talk about not only school-based arts education, but the importance of cultural partnerships or engagement in community. But the thrust of our work has been focused primarily on what's happening in the schools and the school districts. But I think we're at a point to think about how best to look at how the regional plan and this work also speaks to some of the work we're talking about here today, which goes beyond that and is bigger than that. Denise, did you want to add anything more specific? Yeah, just want to let Denise add something more specific.
So the two very clear additions to the update will be, yes, we'll continue to think through the arts in schools. And now we have this strand of arts in communities and how do different county departments work holistically. And then another piece that will be a new strand is the pathways for young people into the creative economy. We see this as an opportunity. There have been these things that have been surfacing, and it just feels that they're all sort of coming to a head at the right moment. And because we had been scheduled to do this update, it's really an opportune time.
Thank you, Denise. Other questions in the audience? Right here.
Good morning. I'm Erin Jordan over at Paramount Pictures, and I think the majority of how we kind of engage in this conversation has been through our volunteers. We have about 500 or so volunteers who say they like to give back and they want to do that with their colleagues, and arts education is right in our wheelhouse. I think we're struggling to find that database of where we can insert these folks in their communities, both in Hollywood and at home, because a lot of people live all over Los Angeles. So how can we connect them with those opportunities, even if it's just exposure? We have a huge music department, we have media arts, we have digital learning, but we're struggling. There's folks that do great work. My friend's place uses art as part of their work with homeless youth in our area, but other than that, we're struggling. So where can we find those resources?
So I just want to share, and then I'll pass it to Shannon, because today we just had at our school a pilot program on the media arts that's very exciting. My friends in the back are waving that they are from the LA County Department of Ed. And so there are many opportunities like that. I would say that the LA County Department of Ed is a great place to start in terms of a database.
I completely agree, and I do think that now that we have new standards that have media arts, so it's from a policy point of view formalized that the media arts are part of the curriculum, that this is a wonderful opportunity for us to scale up. There's a broad difference in the media arts. There's between high schools all over the county. So I think organizing this now that we have new standards that are 3 weeks old is just a great ground zero for us. And I see a lot of funding opportunities to make that equitable across the county. Of course, you're dealing with digital production and knowledge in digital production. So the blend of let's put some money in so that they can get the tools to work with and combine it with people in the industry that know how to use those tools and go through those creative processes already, just seems like a magic mentor situation for me. So I think that would be a great thing to build.
So as Denise just mentioned around career pathways, we have been doing work in this area, which we're poised to expand at this moment. So both in the Arts Ed Collective, so I want to actually just take one moment to talk about the Arts Ed Collective, which is not a closed group. So it is open to others for joining, and there are plenty of folks who would be happy to tell you about that. And it's work that we do advancing all of this with not only private philanthropy, but also we have a lot of folks from the arts and entertainment world in terms of their corporate social responsibility arm or others, like Sony Pictures and others. So there's a lot of great interest there. But specifically around creative pathways, out of the County Cultural Equity and Inclusion Initiative, one of the recommendations that the Board of Supervisors approved and moved forward was for us to develop a Youth Arts Career Pathways Initiative. We are about to launch the first step, which has been a field scan, because we know that actually there's a lot of this work happening all over the place, all over the county, from CBOs to post-secondary schools to folks like Paramount and Warner Brothers, who each have their own internships and other kinds of programs. And so our goal is to really identify the findings of what's happening in the landscape and recommendations for how we can create a full pathways initiative that has multiple access points to this work. In those recommendations, I will tell you exposure to careers is certainly one of the areas that has come up where we see a gap. And so we will be releasing those findings in the next month or so, including to stakeholders in the creative economy and looking at how we best move that forward. So I'd love to include you on that and others. So give us your contact information. And then also the board also put forward a motion specifically on film and digital media and how we can best support pathways there. And so we are also playing a role in that work. Additionally, if you think back to the Arts Ed profile Denise talked about, we do have a lot of information about all the schools and all the 81 school districts across the county, who's doing what. So in addition to a roster of teaching artist partners, so we also can just be a resource for information if that's helpful.
Carolyn, you wanted to?
Yes, and a practical thing that you guys can do to help us is we have a Directing Change film program that we are working with Each Mind Matters, where we are charging the state of California, but really focusing on LA County, 6th graders on up to develop short PSAs on mental health, suicide prevention through the lens of culture that we would love some support with. Ideas are brimming that maybe we can assign, one of your people to each of the school districts so that everyone could submit a form. And then what's neat is that they're going to be recognized in a red carpet event in LA. I believe it's May 21st. But the deadline is March 1st. I'll definitely give information out to be sent to all you guys, but it's a wonderful evidence-based practice that's been going on. And Dottie and I are charging to kind of bring the most presentations and PSAs from LA County. So that's our charge. So if you could help us with that, it's really short and it would be wonderful to pair up a student or a school with a professional to really kind of hit home the importance of learning this. So
come on down.
Yes.
Two more questions. We'll take the young lady right there and then the young gentleman right here.
Thanks for calling me a young lady. My name is Joanne Webb. I'm the director of the Career Center at the Actors Fund, and we have a very wonderful teaching artist program of those people who are in media arts and are professionals. But in the role of the artist, they also have this situation where they don't work all the time, so they need other work, and this is work that's really meaningful to them to be able to do it. Two questions, twofold. One is the opportunity for teaching artists to be able to get individual grants, to be able to go into different places and do what they need to do, because one of the issues we run into, people are interested, but then they can't pay them, and that's part of the, and they'll do it, but that's part of the deal too. Or organizations that would have the funding for bringing people from the outside in, right? And then the second question was really about that intergenerational stuff, about the idea of having artists going into working with seniors, and because that bringing children together. They've done this, I know, a lot with an organization called Engage, where they have the senior arts colonies, and they actually set them up near schools where the kids are not doing well in school anymore, and they pair them off with them like almost like a grandparent program. And all those kids have been able to get back into the schools through that experience. So it's a combination of the arts and the really the multi-generational piece, which I think is really where we are right now. There are more older people on the planet right now than there are younger people, and it's never been like that before. So I just wanted to have your feedback on either or both of those questions.
Two quick responses so we get to the last question, and then to Lillian. And
Yes, I'd like to start. So those mini grants for artists are wonderful, but I think what creates more impact is when we're able to use that funding and be able to make it part of a systemic program. So right now, our artists in residence we have puppetry, we have drama focused on the Civil War, we have African drumming and storytelling, we have dance, we have hip hop, we have Irish dance. We have we have any number of artists, and what we're able to do is incorporate them into our program. So we love having a great diversity of artists, and there is absolutely opportunities. So I'd ask you to reach out.
And a quick response.
I was just thinking that there has already been a lot of work going in that philosophy of mentoring. The way we train teachers now in the state of California is through an induction program, and they receive mentorship from usually someone at their site or a retired teacher, and the same with administrators. So I think that philosophy is already very embedded into the education system, and I think that moving this into the arts, particularly media arts and other disciplines as well, seems to be a nice bridge to a system that education is already quite accustomed to and already embraces, because we do this in our field, in our own training.
This will be the last question. You're in the hot seat.
Yeah. You said better be good. My name is DeMarco White, and I'm with the House of Blues Music Forward Foundation. I am their program manager. My question is about, as we talk about schools and us working together to bring arts back into the schools, what I'm finding is because we don't sit in really that after school space, a struggle in terms of identifying the champion within the school district and the local schools, who's not only the decision maker, but the facilitator of these opportunities. The schools are often running into problems such as transportation, or really finding a space for the youth to collectively get together and talk about this. And we focus directly on music. And so if our partners, such as our schools, don't have strong music programs, it makes it very difficult for us to identify those next step opportunities, whether it's on the on-stage pathway or the off-stage pathway. So I guess, put simply, my question is, who are you all identifying with on the local level are your champions to drive these initiatives forward?
Question.
I think we have a collaboration between LACO, Department of Mental Health, and UCLA that would be a wonderful vehicle and pass through for that initiative. And if we can connect after and kind of get your name, and we'll bring that over. We're doing regional events throughout the county. We started in Antelope Valley. We had this on Monday, then we're going Downey, Hacienda, then we're going to circle back to Dockweiler. So there's an opportunity to kind of bring the message out to the schools district and superintendents that really make those decisions. So let's definitely connect.
I would say the same thing. It's difficult going from school to school or district to district. I would start with the Arts Commission. I would start with the county and get yourself onto a list that I'm sure exists, and that's the way to go about it. But the need is great, so please reach out.
And our folks, like was mentioned before with the coaches, are working with so many of the schools. We've now worked with 70 of the 81. to integrate arts into strategic planning so that it really goes up to that level, but also to think about what resources they need. Do they have a coordinator or liaison who's actually facilitating arts? Do they have existing programs? So really looking at that, because that is an issue we've heard.
I will take the moderator's prerogative and ask the final question. You have a diverse group of individuals who are representing funders in the arts and education, youth development, other parallel sectors. And so the final question, 30 seconds or less, what can they do to help advance and/or to support your work? 30 seconds, we'll start with Superintendent Maldonado.
Okay. Well, for us, it is about funding. I'm going to be blunt. But I think it's about the vision as well, and having that tremendous vision for the arts and supporting the work that exists and finding how to make those connections and integration, I think is really the key.
I think for us, it's partnership and collaboration, relationship building, because that's the only way things move here.
I'll echo certainly public-private partnership. I'd also say the regional plan update is an opportunity for advocacy, not only within this room, but helping to get everything down from schools to communities to students, youth voice, really just getting advocacy around arts education so that its value is there and it can be pushed forward as a systemic.
Create funding and outcomes for whoever you fund. Hold us accountable to doing what you fund, because that helps with sustainability of funding.
And I also think being clear about where you think your greatest strength is, when you're talking about pre-K 12 and maybe into our community, our junior college system, and then you have 5 different disciplines. To just talk arts education is a really broad term. Are we talking about 5-year-olds in visual art? Are we talking about media art with 12th graders that are ready to go into a career? So really looking at your resources and where you would like to channel your money, I think would help you pinpoint, where you'd like to fund.
That is all the time we have. Why don't we give a huge round of applause for this amazing panel. And we thank you for your questions, and we look forward to the next time we meet.
Thank you not only to the panel, but to the amazing moderator too. Thank you. So I'm just going to take the last couple minutes to talk about next steps. If this was a conversation that you were interested in and you're interested in continuing to engage, I just wanted to bring some points to your attention. The state of California, through a statewide coalition called Create California, in the fall launched a statewide Create California campaign to really bring attention and public will, highlight public will around this issue statewide. And the LA County initiative for that, the LA County Public Will campaign will be launching in March. So keep an eye for that. The statewide is Create California. The countywide initiative will be Create LA County, and it'll all be aligned messaging. Secondly, the LA Magazine is partnering with the Wallace in February, and they are going to have another conversation looking at the state of arts education in LA County. That'll be on February 20th. If that's something that, this was a closed event for your constituent group, but if you have others that you think might benefit from this kind of conversation, please and make sure that they hear about it, invite them to attend or join them. I talked about the Arts Ed profile and all the data we were able to share. If your grantees are working in schools, please encourage them to talk to the school principal and make sure that they are represented in the school's data. This is an ongoing interactive website, so any school, as long as it's a principal who said who allows it, can update their data at any time, and it gets like refreshed quarterly. So if an arts organization is working at a school and they're not named in that school's data set, encourage them to have conversation about that. Please do join us for the LA County Regional Plan. We'll be making sure that you get lots of information about all the convenings that are happening around that. And if you are interested in continuing to engage in this kind of conversation with other funders, there are many members of the Arts Collectives Funders Council in the room, and please feel free to have further conversation with them. All of these things are listed in page 3 of your program. And all of the Funders Council members are on the back cover. One final, few final giant thank yous to our co-chairs, Wendy Chang and Angel Roberson. Thank you. And also to our amazing partners at Southern California Grant Makers. So thank you, Morgan, for being our host. And we just look forward to the continued conversation.
May I invite them to our site visit? So the council is going to be, and the commission is doing a site visit if you're interested in seeing what this looks like in person on February 26th at our school district. And we'll get Denise the information. So you're all very welcome to see what it looks like in the classroom.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a great idea. Yes.